4 months after his beloved wife, Eleanor, passed away, 68-year-old Arthur Pendleton took her broken reading glasses to be repaired. They were the last thing she wore every single day, the most precious keepsake the grieving widower had left. But when the technician, an old friend named Marcus, examined the metal hinges under his loupe, his hands began to tremble. Marcus didn't hand the glasses back. Instead, he walked to the front window, locked the shop door against the gray Portland rain, and pulled Arthur into the dimly lit back room. Looking at Arthur with pure dread, he whispered a warning that would shatter the old man's entire world. "Arthur, check Eleanor's will immediately, before you're the next one in the grave." Then, with shaking fingers, Marcus showed him exactly what Eleanor had hidden inside the frames. The air in the tiny, dust-filled workshop felt instantly heavy and suffocating. Arthur stared blankly as Marcus used a pair of precision jeweler tweezers to extract something impossibly small from the broken right hinge. It was a micro-memory card, no larger than a fingernail, cleverly concealed within the thick metallic band of Eleanor's vintage glasses. Arthur could not comprehend what he was looking at. Eleanor was a retired literature teacher. She baked peach pies and spent her evenings reading classic novels by the fireplace. She had absolutely no reason to possess hidden surveillance equipment. Marcus did not speak another word. The old watchmaker simply turned to his cluttered wooden workbench, sweeping aside tiny gears, screws, and springs to make room for his battered laptop. The harsh blue light of the screen washed over their deeply lined faces, casting long, grim shadows against the brick wall. Outside, the relentless Portland storm hammered against the shop roof and the front window, sounding like 1,000 ticking clocks counting down to a disaster. Marcus plugged the tiny card into a small adapter and pushed it into the computer. A folder popped up on the screen, filled with video and audio files. All of them were dated from the first week of April, the exact week Arthur had lost the love of his life. "Marcus, what is this?" Arthur asked, his voice barely a dry, scraping whisper. Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes refusing to meet Arthur's terrified gaze. "I only watched the first one, Arthur. I had to know why she came to me asking for a hidden camera 3 months ago. I promised her I would never tell you unless something terrible happened to her. I am so sorry." With a trembling click of the mouse, the first video began to play. The footage was slightly grainy at first, rocking with the gentle motion of someone setting the glasses down on a flat surface before it stabilized perfectly. Arthur felt a cold, jagged knot form in his stomach. The camera angle captured a very familiar space. It was his own kitchen. He could see the edge of the oak island, the hanging copper pots, and the window overlooking their rain-soaked garden. The timestamp in the corner glowed brightly in white text, showing a Tuesday morning, just 3 days before Eleanor suffered what the emergency room doctors had confidently called a massive, fatal stroke. The kitchen was entirely empty for a few agonizing seconds. Then, a figure walked into the frame. Arthur stopped breathing. It was Julian, his only child. The 40-year-old corporate lawyer whose framed university diplomas hung proudly in Arthur's hallway. Julian looked immaculate, dressed in his expensive charcoal gray suit, his hair perfectly styled for another day of high-stakes negotiations in the city. He moved with a relaxed, chilling confidence. There was no hesitation in his steps, no nervous glancing over his shoulder to see if anyone was watching. Julian walked straight to the corner cabinet where Eleanor kept her daily vitamins and prescription medications. Arthur watched, completely paralyzed by a rising tide of horror, as his son reached up and pulled down the amber bottle of Eleanor's vital heart medication. Julian set the bottle on the granite counter with a soft clack. From the inner pocket of his tailored jacket, he withdrew a small, clear plastic bag. Inside the bag were dozens of unfamiliar white capsules. Arthur wanted to scream. He wanted to shatter the laptop screen, to reach through the glowing digital window and grab his son by the throat. But he was trapped in that dark back room, glued to the wooden stool, forced to watch a nightmare unfold in real time. Julian unscrewed the childproof cap effortlessly. He dumped his mother's life-saving medication into his palm and casually slipped the vital pills into his pants pocket. Then, he opened the plastic bag and poured the strange, lethal white capsules into the empty amber bottle. He snapped the cap back on and placed the bottle exactly where he had found it, taking an extra second to make sure the pharmacy label faced the exact same direction it always did. The entire process took less than a minute. But the horror did not end there. What shattered Arthur's heart into a million irreparable pieces was what Julian did next. After planting the poison that would inevitably kill the woman who gave him life, Julian turned toward the ceramic fruit bowl resting on the kitchen island. He picked up a crisp green apple. He took a large bite, chewing slowly, his face completely devoid of any emotion, guilt, or fear. It was the blank, unbothered face of a man completing a mundane office task. Still chewing his apple, Julian grabbed a clean dish towel from the oven handle. He meticulously wiped down the amber pill bottle, the cabinet knob, and the granite counter, ensuring absolutely no fingerprints were left behind. He took one final bite of the apple, tossed the core into the sink, and casually strolled out of the camera's view. The video ended, freezing on the image of the empty, quiet kitchen. The silence in the repairs shop was deafening, broken only by the steady, relentless drumming of the storm outside. Arthur sat frozen. His mind violently rejected what his own eyes had just witnessed. Frantic denial clawed at his throat. There had to be a mistake. A massive, terrible misunderstanding. Maybe Julian was just organizing her pills for the week. Maybe it was a harmless supplement. But the icy reality of Eleanor's death, the terrifying suddenness of her heart stopping in the middle of the dark night, crushed his desperate hopes into dust. The boy he had taught to ride a bicycle, the son he had carried on his shoulders at the state fair, the man he had trusted completely, had methodically executed his own mother. Arthur tried to inhale, but his lungs refused to expand. A profound, suffocating physical pain radiated through his chest, so intense he thought his own heart might stop beating right then and there. It felt as though the very foundation of his entire life had been ripped away, leaving him plummeting into an endless, pitch-black abyss. He looked slowly at the broken glasses resting on the workbench. Eleanor had known. His sweet, fiercely protective wife had known her own son was a monster, and she had sat alone in her kitchen, recording her own murder just to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for him. Arthur lowered his face into his trembling, calloused hands. The broken, grieving widower who had walked into the shop 20 minutes ago was dead. In his place, a terrifying, cold realization began to take root in the darkest shadows of Arthur's shattered mind. The illusion of his perfect family was gone, murdered by his own flesh and blood. And if Julian had killed Eleanor, the warning from Marcus was not just a fury. Arthur was next. Marcus hesitated, his hand hovering over the computer mouse. He looked at Arthur with bloodshot eyes, his face pale in the glow of the screen. He quietly explained that there was a second video, recorded just hours after the first one. Arthur did not speak. He simply gave a slight, rigid nod. He had to see the entirety of the nightmare. He had to know exactly how his wife spent her final moments on Earth. Marcus clicked the file. The screen flickered to life, displaying a timestamp of 2:47 in the morning. The camera was sitting near the edge of the kitchen counter, angled toward the breakfast nook. The room was mostly dark, illuminated only by the faint, yellow glow of the stove light. For a moment, there was nothing but the ambient hum of the refrigerator. Then, Eleanor stumbled into the frame. She was clutching her chest, her face contorted in agony. She gasped for air, reaching blindly for the edge of the granite counter to steady herself, but her trembling hand slipped. She collapsed heavily, falling out of the camera view. The sickening thud of her body hitting the hardwood floor echoed sharply through the tiny laptop speakers. The vibration from her fall knocked the glasses off the counter. The image tumbled wildly before settling sideways on the floor tiles. The right lens was cracked, but the hidden camera continued to record, pointing directly at the space where Eleanor lay gasping. Arthur gripped the edge of the wooden workbench so hard his knuckles turned completely white. A low, guttural sound of pure anguish escaped his throat. He watched his wife fighting for every breath, completely helpless. Then, footsteps echoed from the hallway stairs. A pair of expensive, gray suede shoes stepped into the frame, stopping mere inches from Eleanor. Julian had been in the house the entire time. He had been waiting in the dark. The suede shoes did not rush toward the struggling woman. Julian did not drop to his knees to administer first aid or frantically search for a phone. He simply stood over her. After a long, agonizing minute, the camera captured the cuff of his tailored trousers shifting as he brought his wrist up. He was checking his watch. The metallic face of his heavy Rolex gleamed faintly in the shadows. He crossed his arms, standing perfectly still like a statue, watching his own mother suffocate on the kitchen floor. Arthur felt a physical sickness twist his stomach. He was forced to count the minutes in agonizing silence alongside the monster he had raised. 5 minutes passed. Then 10 minutes. Eleanor's ragged breathing grew fainter, weaker, until it stopped entirely. Still, Julian waited. He waited exactly 15 minutes to ensure the lethal poison had fully completed its task and there was absolutely no chance of paramedics reviving her. Only when the silence in the kitchen became absolute did Julian reach into his pocket and pull out his phone. He dialed 911. The moment the operator answered, Julian's cold, calculating demeanor vanished instantly. His voice cracked with a terrifying, flawless performance of a devastated, panicked son. He cried into the receiver, begging the operator to send help, claiming he had just come downstairs for a glass of water and found his mother unresponsive. The video abruptly cut to black. Arthur sat in the dimly lit repair shop, his breathing shallow and rapid. The crushing, paralyzing grief that had consumed him for 4 months was suddenly incinerated by a blinding, terrifying rage. His son had curated a murder, executing it with the precision of a seasoned psychopath. Marcus gently touched Arthur on the shoulder, snapping him out of the dark void. The technician pointed to the laptop screen, where a single audio file sat below the videos. Marcus explained that it was created just 2 hours before Eleanor collapsed. With a heavy sigh, Marcus clicked play. The sound of rain tapping against a window filled the room. Then, Eleanor's voice echoed through the dusty shop. Hearing her speak again, soft and full of sorrow, broke the very last barrier in Arthur's heart. Hot tears finally spilled down his weathered cheeks. "Arthur, my sweet Arthur," she began, her voice trembling with fear. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and I am so incredibly sorry I left you alone. I tried to fix this, but I fear I am out of time." Arthur closed his eyes, clinging to every syllable. "Julian knows that I found out," Eleanor continued, her tone growing desperate and breathless. "He has been stealing from us, Arthur. Over the past 18 months, he systematically siphoned $800,000 from our joint retirement fund. He is drowning in debt to a shadow syndicate in the city, terrible people from the underground casinos. When I confronted him yesterday, I saw something entirely dead in his eyes. He told me that if I went to the police, he would make sure I had a fatal accident. He is not our little boy anymore. He is empty inside. Arthur felt a cold sweat break out across his neck. The motive was greed. Pure, unadulterated greed. I could not bear to tell you and break your heart while I was still trying to gather enough evidence to stop him. Eleanor wept softly into the microphone. I changed my will yesterday. I wrote down everything I discovered, every bank transfer, every lie, and I put the documents in a safe deposit box at the downtown bank. Box number 447. The key is taped behind our wedding portrait in the hallway. You must go there, Arthur. The recording grew very quiet. Eleanor took one final, shuddering breath. Please forgive my silence, my love. I only wanted to protect you from this nightmare. But you have to be careful now. Do not confront him. Do not let him know you have these glasses. He thinks the old will is still valid, and he thinks he will inherit everything now that I am out of the way. But once he realizes the money is tied up, he will come looking for the rest. He will come for the house, the life insurance, everything. Arthur, you have to run and hide. Because if he did this to me, you are the next one in the grave. The audio file ended with a soft click, leaving Arthur alone with the echoing truth. The boy he loved was gone. A predator wore his face, and that predator was currently hunting him. The morning light failed to pierce the thick canopy of storm clouds suffocating Portland. Arthur stood in the deafening silence of his hallway, staring up at the large wedding portrait hanging near the front door. He and Eleanor were smiling back at him from 40 years ago, completely oblivious to the monster they would eventually bring into the world. He reached behind the ornate wooden frame, his fingertips brushing against the cool wallpaper until they grazed a small square of tape. He pulled it free. A tiny brass key dropped into his palm. It was the key to box 447. Arthur did not bother with an umbrella. He walked out into the relentless downpour, letting the freezing rain soak his coat as he climbed into his old sedan. The drive to the downtown bank was a blur of sweeping windshield wipers and gray concrete. His mind replayed the horrifying images from the hidden camera on an endless, agonizing loop. The grief that had paralyzed him for the last 4 months was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was no longer a mourning widower. He was a target. The downtown bank branch was quiet, filled with the hushed murmurs of tellers and the smell of polished marble. Arthur presented his identification to the vault manager, a sharply dressed woman who offered him a polite, sympathetic smile. She guided him through the heavy steel doors and down a corridor lined with thousands of metal drawers. She stopped at box 447, inserted her master key, and gestured for Arthur to use his. With a synchronized turn, the lock disengaged. The manager handed him the long metal box and directed him to a private viewing room, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. Arthur sat at the small table in the center of the windowless room. The air was sterile and cold. He took a deep breath and opened the lid. Inside rested a thick manila envelope. He opened the clasp and slid the contents onto the table. The first thing he saw was a stack of handwritten pages. The elegant, sweeping cursive was unmistakably Eleanor's. The paper was slightly warped in several places, the ink blurred by dried teardrops. Arthur traced his trembling fingers over the letters, feeling the phantom presence of his wife in the room with him. The letter detailed her quiet investigation over the past year. She documented every suspicious withdrawal Julian had made from their retirement accounts, detailing how he had masterfully forged their signatures to bypass the bank alerts. But it was the second document that revealed the true depth of Eleanor's protective love. It was a new last will and testament, notarized and filed legally just days before her murder. Arthur read the precise legal jargon carefully. Eleanor had completely disinherited their son. Julian was entitled to absolutely nothing. Instead, her entire half of their shared estate, every single penny, was to be donated to a charitable foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from financial abuse. Julian had murdered his mother under the assumption that the old will was still in place. He thought her death would instantly unlock hundreds of thousands of dollars to pay off his massive debts to the underground syndicate. He had killed her for a payday that no longer existed. Arthur set the will aside and reached for the final document in the box. It was bound in a heavy blue folder. He opened it, expecting more bank statements or property deeds. Instead, he found an insurance contract. It was a comprehensive life insurance policy issued by a massive corporate firm Arthur had never done business with in his entire life. He scanned the front page, his blood turning to ice. The policy was taken out on his own life. The total payout in the event of his accidental death or sudden medical failure was a staggering $2 million. Arthur flipped to the final page of the extensive contract. At the bottom, on the dotted line, was his signature. It looked perfect. The loop of the A, the sharp cross of the T, it was a flawless imitation of his handwriting. But Arthur had never seen this document before. He looked at the date. The policy had been activated exactly 1 month before Eleanor collapsed in the kitchen. His eyes darted to the section labeling the primary beneficiary. There was only one name listed: Julian Pendleton. The terrifying puzzle pieces slammed together with brutal, undeniable logic. Julian was currently navigating the complex probate process, trying to discreetly access his mother's wealth. Any day now, the lawyers would inform the son that the original will was void and he was entitled to nothing. When that happened, the syndicate would come for Julian's life. The corporate lawyer would be completely out of options. His only path to survival, his only remaining source of millions to clear his debts and maintain his lavish lifestyle with Chloe, was the forged insurance policy sitting on the table. But the policy only paid out if Arthur died. Eleanor had figured it all out. She had known the depth of Julian's depravity, and she had meticulously gathered the proof to show Arthur exactly why he was in mortal danger. She had used her final days to build a shield for him from beyond the grave. Arthur folded the forged insurance policy and placed it back into the manila envelope along with his wife's tear-stained letter and the new will. He closed the metal box. When he stood up from the table, the trembling in his hands had completely stopped. The broken old man was dead. A quiet, burning vow of absolute vengeance took root in his soul. He would not just survive. He would destroy the monster who wore his son's face. Arthur stepped out of the downtown bank and back into the freezing Portland downpour. He clutched his leather briefcase tight against his chest, shielding the manila envelope inside as if it were a fragile, beating heart. The drive back through the city felt different now. The overwhelming fog of grief had lifted, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline focus. He remembered the business card Marcus had pressed into his palm before he left the repair shop. The technician had told him he needed someone ruthless, someone who understood the dark intersections of family trust and criminal greed. Arthur parked his sedan outside a modest brick building in the Pearl District. He took a deep breath, smoothing his damp coat, and walked up the stairs to the second floor. The frosted glass door read the name Sarah Jenkins, attorney at law. There were no lavish mahogany desks or panoramic city views here. It was a practical, Spartan office designed for fighting ugly battles. Sarah Jenkins was a woman of 50, with piercing brown eyes and hair pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense bun. She had built her career defending the elderly from predatory relatives and financial abusers. When Arthur sat across from her battered metal desk and pulled the documents from his briefcase, she did not offer empty platitudes about his loss. She simply listened. Arthur placed the memory card from Eleanor's glasses on the desk, followed by the forged $2 million life insurance policy, the handwritten letter, and a new will. He explained everything in a steady, hollow voice. He told her about the video of his son poisoning his mother, the agonizing 15-minute wait, and the terrible realization of what the forged insurance policy meant for his own future. Sarah plugged the memory card into her laptop. She watched the footage in absolute silence. Her expression did not change. She did not gasp or cover her mouth in shock. Instead, her jaw tightened and her eyes grew dark with professional calculation. She read Eleanor's letter twice, tracing the forged signature on the life insurance document with the tip of her pen. When she finally looked up, her gaze was piercing. She told Arthur that his wife had given him an incredible, life-saving gift, but it had also placed him in the most dangerous position imaginable. Julian was not a common thug. He was a highly educated, deeply connected corporate lawyer. Julian understood the legal system inside and out. He knew exactly how to launder money, how to manipulate timelines, and most importantly, how to destroy evidence. If Julian caught even a single hint that Arthur knew the truth, Sarah warned, he would escalate his timeline immediately. He would not wait for a convenient accident. He would eliminate Arthur the very same day and use his legal expertise to bury the truth forever. Sarah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, and laid out the survival rules. Arthur had to become an actor. He had to continue playing the role of the devastated, broken, and slightly confused widower. He could not avoid Julian's calls. He could not refuse his visits. He had to smile at the man who murdered his wife. He had to offer him coffee, ask about his day at the corporate firm, and act as though his mind was slowly deteriorating from the grief. He had to be the perfect, unsuspecting prey. Arthur felt a sickening churn in his stomach at the thought of looking into Julian's eyes and pretending to love him. But he nodded. He would do whatever it took. He would become the hollow shell of a man his son expected him to be. Sarah leaned back in her chair and tapped her pen against the desk. She told Arthur that the videos and the forged documents were a powerful foundation, but defense attorneys could argue that the video was tampered with, or that the white pills were just a different brand of medication. Julian would claim the insurance policy was a misunderstanding. To lock Julian away for the rest of his natural life, they needed undeniable, physical proof of the poison inside Eleanor's body. They needed a homicide investigation. Without asking for permission, Sarah picked up her desk phone and dialed a private number. She told Arthur there was only one person in the Portland police force she trusted with a case this delicate and explosive. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. Sarah did not bother with pleasantries. She asked for Detective Ray Miller from the Major Crimes Division. She spoke quietly into the receiver, stating that she was sitting with a client who possessed video evidence of a corporate attorney poisoning his own mother for an $800,000 inheritance, and that the killer was actively planning to murder his father for a $2 million life insurance payout. Sarah paused, listening to the voice on the other end. She nodded once, gave the detective her office address, and hung up the phone. She looked across the desk at Arthur. The homicide detective was on his way. The private nightmare was over. The trap was finally being set, and Arthur was the bait. The heavy oak front door chimed, shattering the fragile silence of the gloomy house. Arthur stood frozen in the kitchen. It was Thursday afternoon. Detective Ray Miller had left the property barely 2 hours ago, having spent the morning meticulously securing a microscopic audio transmitter beneath the collar of Arthur's thick wool cardigan. Ray had warned him that a sudden visit was highly probable. Predators rarely let their prey wander out of sight for long. Arthur shuffled toward the foyer, forcing his spine to curve, adopting the frail, broken posture Sarah Jenkins had commanded him to wear. He opened the door to find the gray Portland rain weeping onto his porch. Standing under a large black umbrella was his son. Julian wore a sympathetic, practiced smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. Clinging tightly to his arm was his wife, Chloe. She looked immaculate in a beige cashmere trench coat, but her knuckles were white as she gripped her expensive leather handbag. Her eyes darted around the hallway nervously, unable to meet Arthur's gaze for more than a passing second. "Dad," Julian said, his voice dripping with honeyed concern. "We were in the neighborhood and wanted to check on you. You have not been answering your phone." "Julian." "Chloe," Arthur rasped, perfectly injecting a tremor into his vocal cords. "Come in. Please. I was just making some tea. My mind has been slipping a bit today. I forgot where your mother kept the chamomile." Arthur turned his back to them, leading the way into the dimly lit living room. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to grab the heavy brass fireplace poker and strike the man who had poisoned his beloved Eleanor. The wire taped to his chest felt as hot as a branding iron. He reminded himself that Detective Miller was listening to a live feed from an unmarked van parked 3 blocks away. He had to play the game. They sat around the low mahogany coffee table. Arthur brought out a tray with porcelain cups and a steaming teapot. His hands shook genuinely now, fueled by the sheer adrenaline of sitting 3 feet away from a sociopath. He poured the tea, letting a few drops spill onto the wooden surface to sell his deteriorating coordination. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, projecting the image of a deeply devoted son. "Dad, Chloe and I have been talking. We are very worried about you. Living in this big house all alone, especially after what happened to Mom. The grief is taking a heavy toll on you." "I am fine, Julian," Arthur mumbled, staring blankly at the floral pattern on his teacup. "Just tired. So very tired." "I know," Julian replied softly. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The very same pocket where he had hidden the lethal white capsules just weeks prior. He pulled out a neatly folded stack of legal papers and placed them on the table. "That is why I had my firm draft these. It is a durable power of attorney for healthcare and property. It just gives me the legal authority to handle the mortgage, pay the utility bills, and make medical decisions for you if you become incapacitated. It will take all the stress off your shoulders so you can just focus on healing." Chloe shifted uncomfortably on the velvet sofa. She picked at the edge of her manicured thumbnail, her breathing shallow. She knew exactly what those papers meant. Once Arthur signed away his legal autonomy, Julian would have undisputed access to every bank account and the power to authorize a do not resuscitate order when the planned tragic accident finally occurred. Arthur stared at the documents. The trap was sprung. Julian was attempting to secure the perimeter before triggering the $2 million life insurance policy. "I do not know, Julian," Arthur stammered, rubbing his temples as if fighting a severe migraine. "Your mother always handled the paperwork. I should probably have a lawyer look at this first." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian's sympathetic smile remained frozen in place, but his eyes hardened into twin chips of black ice. The charming facade cracked, revealing the impatient, ruthless predator lurking just beneath the skin. "Dad, I am a lawyer," Julian said, his tone dropping an octave, losing a fraction of its warmth. "I am your son. Who else are you going to trust with your life? You are not thinking clearly. Mom would want you to do this. She would want me to take care of you." Hearing Julian weaponize Eleanor's memory made Arthur want to vomit. He slowly reached out, his trembling fingers hovering over the expensive fountain pen Julian had placed next to the documents. He picked it up. Julian exhaled softly, a micro-expression of absolute victory passing over his face. Chloe finally stopped picking at her thumbnail, letting out a long, shaky breath of relief. Arthur brought the tip of the pen toward the signature line. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement perfectly mimicking a severe muscle spasm, his elbow violently struck the side of his full teacup. The scalding chamomile tea cascaded across the mahogany table, completely soaking the thick legal documents. The dark liquid pooled over the signature lines, rendering the paper a soggy, illegible mess. "Oh, dear God," Arthur cried out, dropping the pen and grabbing a napkin to dab uselessly at the ruined pages. "Look what I have done. I am so clumsy. My hands just will not stop shaking today. I am so sorry, Julian." Julian stared at the ruined paperwork. For 3 agonizing seconds, absolute, unmasked fury contorted his handsome features. His jaw locked so tightly the muscles twitched under his skin. He looked at Arthur not as a father, but as a stubborn, pathetic obstacle that desperately needed to be eradicated. Chloe flinched, shrinking back into the sofa cushions, terrified of her husband's sudden silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the demon vanished. Julian blinked, forcing a tight, strained smile back onto his face. He stood up, smoothly gathering the dripping papers into a useless clump. "It is all right, Dad," Julian said, his voice clipped and tight. "It was just an accident. I will print fresh copies at the office and bring them by later this week. You just rest now." Julian and Chloe practically fled the house, the heavy front door clicking shut behind them. Arthur stood alone in the quiet living room. He stared at the spilled tea, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He slowly reached up and tapped the collar of his wool cardigan twice. "Tell me you heard all of that, Detective," Arthur whispered to the empty room. A faint, crackling static sounded in a tiny earpiece hidden deep in Arthur's left ear, followed by Ray Miller's grim, steady voice. "Loud and clear, Arthur. The bait is set. He is getting desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." The agonizing encounter in the living room had accelerated everything. The very next evening, Arthur sat in the sterile conference room of Sarah Jenkins' law office alongside Detective Ray Miller. The air was thick with a grim, unspoken reality. The audio recordings and the hidden camera footage were powerful tools, but they were still circumstantial in the eyes of a ruthless defense attorney. Julian could argue the white pills were harmless dietary supplements. He could claim the audio was taken entirely out of context. To secure a murder conviction that would lock his son away for the rest of his natural life, they needed undeniable, physical proof. They needed the poison. Ray Miller leaned across the table, his face illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights. He explained that potassium chloride, the lethal substance Julian had most likely used to induce the fatal heart attack, dissipated rapidly in the bloodstream. However, a skilled forensic pathologist could still detect microscopic trace amounts of the chemical in the deep muscle tissues of the heart and liver, even months after death. But to retrieve those samples, they had to cross a devastating threshold. They had to wake Eleanor up. Arthur signed the petition for the exhumation with a heavy, trembling hand. The judge, presented with the overwhelming preliminary evidence in a closed-door session, granted the secret order within hours. At 4 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday, the Portland cemetery was a landscape of pure, Gothic nightmare. The relentless rain had turned the sprawling grounds into a sea of dark mud and wet granite. Arthur stood beneath a large black umbrella, his thick wool coat offering no protection against the bone-chilling wind blowing off the Willamette River. He was completely alone on the edge of the family plot, flanked only by Detective Miller and Sarah Jenkins. Sarah stood beside him, her face an unreadable mask of professional stoicism, holding the thick legal injunction that made this waking nightmare possible. She knew the immense psychological toll this was taking on the old man, but she also knew it was the only path to true justice. A few yards away, the blinding glare of portable halogen floodlights cut through the absolute darkness, illuminating a small crew of men in heavy yellow rain slickers. The roar of a small backhoe engine shattered the sacred, peaceful silence of the graveyard. Every scrape of the metal bucket against the wet earth felt like a physical blow to Arthur's chest. They were digging into the very soil he had wept over just 4 months prior. Arthur watched the dark mud pile up on the pristine green grass. His chest heaved with silent, agonizing sobs. This was the ultimate violation. His beautiful, gentle Eleanor, who had spent her entire life nurturing a family and creating a home filled with warmth and literature, was now being hauled out of the cold earth like a piece of discarded evidence. And it was all because of the boy she had carried in her womb. The backhoe engine finally sputtered and died, leaving only the sound of the driving rain and the clinking of thick metal chains. The workers secured the heavy nylon straps around the mahogany casket. With a slow, mechanical whine, the winch lifted Eleanor out of her resting place. The polished wood was slick with mud and water, gleaming horribly under the harsh white floodlights. A white medical examiner van was parked on a narrow asphalt path just a few feet away. The back doors were thrown open, revealing a sterile, brightly lit stainless steel interior that contrasted sickeningly with the muddy graveyard. The chief medical examiner, a stern woman in a dark raincoat, stepped forward. She offered Arthur a brief, deeply sympathetic nod before turning her attention to the casket. Ray Miller placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Arthur's shoulder, quietly suggesting that he return to the warm car. He did not need to witness the physical extraction of the tissue samples. But Arthur shook his head. He planted his feet firmly into the wet grass, his jaw locked in grim determination. He owed it to Eleanor to stand by her, to bear witness to the absolute horror their son had inflicted upon them. The workers carefully transferred the casket into the back of the medical examiner van. The heavy doors closed, shutting Arthur out, but he knew exactly what was happening inside. Scalpels were cutting through the fine silk dress he had chosen for her funeral. Vials were being filled with tissue from her heart, the very same heart that had loved Julian unconditionally for 40 years. Standing in the freezing downpour, staring at the empty, muddy crater in the earth, Arthur felt the last remaining shreds of his paternal instinct wither and die, turning into cold, gray ash. The profound sadness that had defined his existence for the past 4 months was entirely gone, replaced by a pure, unadulterated hatred so intense it frightened him. Julian had not just murdered his mother. He had desecrated her memory, stripped her of her dignity, and forced her husband to violate her final resting place just to prove the terrible truth. Arthur looked up at the dark, weeping sky. The rain mixed with the hot tears on his weathered face. He made a silent, unbreakable vow to the woman inside the white van. He would not just send Julian to prison. He would tear down the pristine, arrogant life his son had built on top of her grave. He would expose the corporate lawyer for the monster he truly was, and he would not rest until Julian had lost absolutely everything. The trap was no longer just about survival. It was about absolute, nuclear retribution. The fragile illusion of control began to crack violently inside Julian Pendleton's corner office. High above the gray, rain-slicked streets of downtown Portland, the corporate attorney paced frantically across his imported Persian rug. It had been 4 agonizing days since the disastrous tea spill at his father's house, and Arthur was now completely unreachable. Every attempt Julian made to call the old man went straight to a generic voicemail. When he tried showing up at the house, he was intercepted by Sarah Jenkins, a bulldog of an elder care attorney who stood on the porch like a fortress guard, claiming Arthur was battling a severe, highly contagious bout of the flu and was under strict medical orders to rest in absolute isolation. Julian ran a trembling, sweaty hand through his perfectly styled hair. He did not believe the flu story for a single, solitary second. Something was wrong. His father had been weak and pliable, but this sudden wall of legal and medical protection felt too calculated. His polished desk phone remained silent, but the cheap, prepaid cellular device hidden deep in his locked bottom drawer began to vibrate with an angry, buzzing intensity. Julian locked his heavy oak office door before answering, his stomach churning with dread. The voice on the other end was quiet, raspy, and carried the terrifying weight of the city's underground syndicate. The grace period for the $800,000 debt had officially expired. The voice calmly informed Julian that if the massive funds were not transferred by the end of the week, they would stop calling and start visiting his beautiful wife, Chloe, at her luxury boutique. Julian hung up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The probate lawyers were already asking difficult, probing questions about Eleanor's missing retirement assets. He was entirely out of time. The $2 million life insurance policy hanging over his father's head was his only remaining exit strategy, his only lifeline, and he could no longer wait for nature, grief, or a fabricated illness to take its course. Across the city, inside the windowless surveillance hub of the Portland Police Bureau, Detective Ray Miller stared intently at a glowing computer monitor. The Cyber Crimes Unit had successfully cloned Julian's burner phone 3 days ago. Lines of encrypted text messages were currently being unscrambled in real time. Sarah Jenkins stood rigidly beside the detective, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the air in the room thick with grim anticipation. A new message popped onto the bright screen. It was sent from Julian to an unregistered number known to the Police Intelligence Unit as a shadowy, ruthless underworld mechanic. The text was brutally clinical, devoid of any human emotion. Julian was authorizing a wire transfer of $50,000 for an immediate, fatal mechanical failure. The instructions Julian typed out were precise and utterly demonic. He ordered the mechanic to sever exactly 70% of the brake lines on Arthur's old sedan. He specified that they must leave just enough tension in the cables so the brakes would function perfectly as Arthur reversed out of his flat driveway, lulling the old man into a false sense of security. The catastrophic failure was designed to occur only when Arthur hit the steep, treacherous, winding descent of the West Hills during his routine Saturday morning grocery run. Ray Miller felt a cold chill run down his spine as he read the glowing words. It was a perfect, virtually untraceable murder plan. An old man, a tragic mechanical failure on a dangerous wet road, a terrible plunge into a deeply wooded ravine. The insurance company investigators would see a poorly maintained vehicle and pay out the $2 million to the grieving son without a second thought. Within 20 minutes, 2 unmarked police cruisers tore through the rain-soaked streets toward Arthur's quiet neighborhood. Ray Miller burst through the front door of the wooden house, finding Arthur sitting calmly in the dark living room, staring silently at the unlit fireplace. The detective did not mince words. He quickly explained the intersected texts, the hired mechanic, and the 70% brake line sabotage planned for the darkness of that very evening. Arthur did not flinch. He did not gasp. He simply absorbed the horrific details of his own scheduled execution with eyes that looked like frozen stones. His son was not just a poisoner, he was a coward hiring a ghost in the night to finish his dirty work. Miller ordered Arthur to pack a small overnight bag immediately. They were moving him to a highly secure, undisclosed safe house on the industrial outskirts of the city. The Portland police could not risk the hired mechanic arriving early or Julian suddenly altering the deadly plan. Arthur grabbed his heavy wool coat, his jaw set in absolute defiance. He turned to Sarah Jenkins, who had arrived moments behind the detectives, and demanded they arrest Julian right then and there. They had the text messages. They had the undeniable intent to commit murder. But Sarah placed a gentle, grounding hand on Arthur's arm and shook her head. She explained that conspiracy to commit murder was a heavy charge, but a skilled, silver-tongued defense attorney like Julian could easily twist digital text messages into a massive, convoluted misunderstanding. He could claim his phone was stolen, or that he was researching a hypothetical scenario for a complex legal thriller. To guarantee a conviction that would bury Julian alive in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole, they needed the absolute physical proof of the toxicology report from Eleanor's exhumation. Furthermore, they needed Julian to step into a physical trap of his own making. They had to let Julian believe his terrible plan was working flawlessly. They had to let him think he had won. Arthur nodded slowly, understanding the cold, calculating logic of the law. He climbed into the back of the heavily armored police vehicle, leaving his childhood home completely dark and empty. As the cruiser pulled away, melting into the dense Portland fog, Arthur looked out the tinted window. He was stepping into the shadows, a living ghost waiting for the perfect moment to haunt the son who had condemned him. The final, inescapable net was being woven, and Julian was blindly swimming straight into the center of it. The sterile walls of the industrial safe house offered Arthur Pendleton absolutely no comfort during his 2 days in hiding. He sat by a reinforced window, watching the endless Portland rain blur the city skyline into a gray smudge. The heavy steel door finally clicked open. Detective Ray Miller stepped inside, shaking the water from his dark coat. In his right hand, he carried a thick, sealed manila folder bearing the official crest of the state medical examiner. Sarah Jenkins followed closely behind him, her expression tighter and more focused than Arthur had ever seen it. Ray placed the damp folder on the metal table in the center of the room. He did not open it immediately. He looked Arthur directly in the eyes and delivered the news they had all been waiting for. The comprehensive toxicology screening from Eleanor's exhumation was complete. The forensic pathologist had discovered a staggeringly high, undeniably lethal concentration of potassium chloride embedded deep within the tissue samples of her heart and liver. The medical examiner had officially changed the cause of death on her certificate. It was no longer a tragic stroke. It was premeditated homicide. Arthur closed his eyes, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. Hearing the scientific confirmation of his wife's murder brought a fresh wave of agony, but it was quickly swallowed by a burning, righteous vindication. They finally had the physical proof. The ghost of his beloved Eleanor had reached out from the cold earth and handed them the weapon to destroy their son. Arthur looked at the detective and demanded they arrest Julian immediately. He wanted to see his son in handcuffs, dragged out of his high-rise corporate office in front of all his wealthy, arrogant colleagues. But Sarah Jenkins shook her head, placing a calming hand on the sealed folder. She paced across the linoleum floor, laying out the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. They had enough for an arrest warrant, yes. But Julian was a master manipulator with millions of dollars in corporate backing. If they arrested him now, he would immediately hire the most ruthless defense team on the West Coast. He would claim the laboratory made a gross error. He would argue that the graveyard soil had contaminated the samples, or that Eleanor had accidentally ingested a toxic dietary supplement. As for the intercepted text messages regarding the brake lines, Julian would simply claim his burner phone had been hacked by the underground syndicate to frame him. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at Arthur. She told him that to guarantee a conviction that would put Julian in a concrete cell for the rest of his natural life, they needed to completely eliminate the concept of reasonable doubt. They needed Julian to confess, or better yet, they needed to catch him in the undeniable act of attempting to murder his own father. A heavy silence descended upon the safe house. Ray Miller rubbed his jaw, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the lawyer was taking the conversation. Using a civilian as active bait in a homicide sting operation violated a dozen departmental protocols. But Arthur did not hesitate. The old engineer stood up from his chair, his posture rigid, his voice completely devoid of fear. He told them he would do it. He proposed a terrifying, incredibly bold plan. The police had already secretly impounded Arthur's sedan, preventing the hired mechanic from ever touching the brake lines. Julian was currently sitting in his office, expecting a phone call from the hospital or the morgue. When that call failed to come, and when Julian realized the mechanic had vanished into the wind, his crushing debt to the syndicate would force him into a corner. Narcissists always believed they were the smartest people in the room, Arthur explained. Julian would decide that if you want a job done right, you have to do it yourself. Arthur instructed Ray to leak a carefully crafted piece of information. They would have Sarah leave a voicemail for Julian, stating that Arthur was feeling much better and had decided to return to his wooden house to rest in his own bed. Arthur would be waiting there, alone in the dark, presenting the perfect, irresistible target for a desperate killer out of time. Ray vehemently protested at first, citing the extreme, unpredictable danger of putting Arthur in the same room as a cornered psychopath. But Arthur's gaze was like forged steel. He reminded the detective that Julian had watched Eleanor suffocate for 15 minutes. Arthur had absolutely nothing left to lose except his demand for absolute justice. Reluctantly, the seasoned detective agreed, but he laid down strict, uncompromising parameters. If Arthur was going back into the lion's den, the Portland police were going to turn the quiet suburban house into an impenetrable fortress. By midnight, under the heavy cover of a torrential downpour, the trap was meticulously set. Dozens of heavily armed tactical officers from the Major Crimes Unit infiltrated the neighborhood like shadows. Snipers took positions on the rooftops of vacant neighboring properties. Undercover surveillance vans disguised as utility trucks parked at both ends of the dead-end street. Inside the house, technicians wired every room with microscopic lenses and high-definition audio transmitters. Arthur walked through his front door, his footsteps echoing in the empty, silent hallway. The house felt entirely different now. It was no longer a home filled with decades of warm memories and the scent of Eleanor's peach pies. It was a hunting ground. He took off his wet coat and walked into the living room, sitting down in his worn armchair. He stared at the front door, his heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm. The net was drawn tight. All the old man had to do now was wait in the shadows for the devil to knock. The grandfather clock in the dim hallway chimed exactly 5 times. Each deep metallic strike bled into the relentless rhythm of the freezing Portland rain battering the front windows. Arthur Pendleton sat perfectly still in his worn velvet armchair. The living room was submerged in heavy, suffocating shadows, pierced only by the weak, yellow glow of a single brass reading lamp resting on the corner end table. Beneath his thick wool cardigan, The microscopic microphone taped to his chest felt like a solid block of ice against his skin. Hidden deep inside the right pocket of his trousers, his calloused thumb rested firmly against the smooth surface of a small plastic panic button. One simple press would bring Detective Ray Miller and the entire tactical SWAT unit crashing through the walls and shattering the windows. For hours, the silence of the old house had been absolute. Then, a sharp metallic click echoed from the front foyer. Someone was gently twisting a spare key in the deadbolt. Arthur did not flinch. He slowed his breathing to a silent crawl, fixing his eyes on the arched doorway leading to the main hall. The heavy oak front door swung open with a soft, familiar creak. A tall figure stepped inside, carefully shutting the door behind him to block out the howling storm. It was Julian. He was dressed in a dark, waterproof trench coat, completely shedding his polished, charismatic corporate lawyer persona. He looked like a ghost wandering the halls, moving with practiced, terrifying silence. Julian stopped in the dark foyer, slowly pulling a pair of tight latex gloves over his hands. He peeked into the kitchen, likely expecting to find it empty. Then, his eyes locked onto the faint light spilling from the living room. Arthur watched his son freeze as he realized the old man was already awake, sitting quietly in the corner. Julian had planned for Arthur to be asleep upstairs, or perhaps rushing out to the car for an early morning grocery run where the severed brake lines would do their deadly, untraceable work. Finding his father fully dressed, perfectly alert, and staring right back at him forced Julian to immediately abandon his primary strategy. But apex predators always carried a backup plan. Julian reached into the deep pocket of his wet coat and slowly withdrew two items. The first was a neatly folded piece of heavy stock paper. The second was a long, sterile medical syringe pre-filled with a deadly clear liquid. It was a terrifying alternative. A staged suicide. The paper was undoubtedly a forged suicide note, crafted flawlessly to mimic Arthur's handwriting, claiming the unbearable grief of losing Eleanor had simply become too much for a frail mind to endure. The syringe held the fatal chemical dose that would make the tragic narrative a physical reality before the morning sun even rose. Julian took a slow, calculated step into the living room. He opened his mouth to speak, likely preparing to weave a complex web of false concern, to ask in a soothing tone why his father was awake so early in the dark. Arthur did not let him utter a single, manipulative syllable. "You are entirely out of time, Julian," Arthur said. His voice did not tremble. The frail, confused, broken widower who had spilled chamomile tea just days prior was completely gone. Arthur spoke with the booming, resonant authority of a judge handing down a final, inescapable sentence. The sheer power and absolute clarity in his tone hit Julian like a physical strike to the chest. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. The fake mask of filial concern melted away instantly, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. His latex-gloved grip tightened around the plastic barrel of the syringe. "I know everything," Arthur continued, his eyes locked onto the black, empty voids of his son's eyes. "I know about the Shadow Syndicate hunting you. I know about the $800,000 you systematically stole from our retirement accounts. I know about the $2 million life insurance policy you forged with my signature." Julian took a staggering step back, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His brilliant, calculating legal mind was desperately trying to process how the pathetic, grieving old man sitting before him had uncovered a perfectly hidden criminal conspiracy. The arrogant confidence that had fueled him for months was rapidly evaporating, leaving behind nothing but raw panic. Arthur slowly leaned forward, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor. His hands rested firmly on his knees. He did not look at the deadly syringe. He looked straight into the corrupted soul of the monster standing in his living room. "You hired an underworld mechanic to sabotage my car," Arthur stated coldly, stripping away every single layer of Julian defenses. "When that coward vanished into the wind, you came here with a needle and a fake letter to finish the job yourself. You planned to kill me for a massive payout to save your own pathetic, greedy life." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The rain continued to batter the glass panes, begging to get inside. Julian stood paralyzed, the latex stretching over his knuckles as his fists clenched and unclenched. He was completely cornered in his childhood home. The perfect, untraceable murder plot had unraveled, exposing the ugly, blood-soaked truth beneath it all. Arthur stood up from his armchair, rising to his full height. He was no longer the unsuspecting prey. He was the architect of his son's destruction, standing exactly where his beloved wife had fallen. "I have only one question for you," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried the terrifying weight of 1,000 broken hearts. "Why did you kill your mother?" The silence hanging in the living room was absolute, save for the relentless drumming of the Portland rain against the glass. Julian stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the man he had underestimated his entire life. The shock on his face slowly melted away, replaced by a twisted, ugly sneer. His narcissistic pride, bruised and cornered, flared into a blinding rage. He could not stand being judged by a man he considered weak and obsolete. "Why?" Julian spat, the word dripping with venom. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, gripping the syringe tighter. "Because she left me absolutely no choice, Dad. She found out about the money. She was going to go to the police. She was going to ruin my career, my reputation, my entire life over a measly $800,000. Do you have any idea what those people from the syndicate would do to me if I did not pay?" Arthur stared at him, his face a mask of cold stone. "So you murdered her to save your own skin?" "I survived," Julian hissed, his voice rising in volume, echoing off the wooden walls. "You and Mom, you had your time. You lived a long, comfortable, boring life in this pathetic old house. You had your decades. Chloe and I are just starting. We belong in the upper echelon. We need that money to maintain our status, to breathe. It is the natural order of things. The old make way for the new." Mom was stubborn. She forced my hand with her ridiculous moral superiority. She actually thought she could cut me out of the will. Julian laughed, a harsh, grating sound that contained zero humor. It was the sound of a completely fractured mind trying to justify the unforgivable. "And then you," Julian continued, pointing the deadly needle toward Arthur. "You just had to keep digging, did you not? You could not just sit quietly and mourn. You became a liability. The $2 million policy was my only way out of this mess. I did not want to do this myself. I paid $50,000 to have your brakes fail. It would have been quick. You would have gone off the West Hills and never felt a thing. But my mechanic vanished, and my time ran out." Julian took another menacing step closer, closing the distance between them. The weak light from the reading lamp caught the terrifyingly sharp tip of the needle. "It is over, Dad," Julian whispered, his eyes wide and manic. "There is no one coming to save you. You are going to sit down, and you are going to let me inject this. If you fight me, it will be messy, and it will hurt. But the end result will be exactly the same. They will find you tomorrow, a broken widower who could not bear the grief of living without his wife." Arthur did not back away. He did not beg for his life. He looked at the syringe, then looked up into the soulless eyes of the killer. "You are right about one thing, Julian," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "The old do make way for the new. But I am not the one whose life is ending tonight." With a firm, deliberate motion, Arthur pressed his thumb down hard on the small plastic panic button hidden deep inside his trouser pocket. He did not even have time to blink before the world exploded. The heavy oak front door was blown off its hinges with a deafening, thunderous crash, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces of wood. Simultaneously, the large glass panes of the living room windows shattered inward, showering the hardwood floor with a cascade of sparkling, deadly rain. The quiet suburban house was instantly flooded with chaotic, blinding light and overwhelming force. Portland police. "Drop the weapon." The roar of a dozen tactical officers filled the room. Heavily armored men clad in black tactical gear poured through every available entrance, moving with terrifying speed and precision. Julian froze, his arms still raised, the syringe hovering just inches away from Arthur. Instantly, over 20 bright red laser sights cut through the dusty air, converging directly on the center of Julian's chest. He looked down at the glowing red dots painting his dark waterproof coat, his breath catching in his throat. The arrogant, untouchable corporate lawyer realized in one shattering second that he had walked blindly into an inescapable trap. Detective Ray Miller stepped through the ruined doorway, his service weapon drawn and leveled squarely at Julian. "Drop it now, or we fire," Miller commanded, his voice slicing through the chaos like a steel blade. The syringe slipped from Julian's trembling latex fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a pathetic, hollow clatter, rolling harmlessly away into the shadows. The forged suicide note fluttered down beside it. Julian's knees buckled. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon him, crushing his massive ego into dust. He collapsed to the floor, raising his hands above his head, weeping uncontrollably as heavily armored officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back and snapping cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sociopathic mask was entirely gone, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, sobbing coward. Across the city, high up in a luxury penthouse overlooking the Willamette River, a secondary strike team was already breaching another door. Chloe Pendleton was pulled from her silk bed sheets, screaming hysterically as she was placed under arrest for accessory to murder and financial fraud. At the exact same moment, the underground mechanic who had accepted the $50,000 contract was cornered and apprehended in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. Arthur stood motionless in his living room, surrounded by the deafening noise of police radios and shouting officers. He watched as they dragged his weeping son out into the pouring rain. The trap had snapped shut flawlessly. The monster was finally caged. The trial took place exactly 7 months after the rainy night the Portland Tactical Unit shattered the windows of Arthur Pendleton's living room. Inside the sterile, brightly lit courtroom, the mountain of undeniable evidence completely suffocated Julian's defense. The high-priced lawyers his corporate firm had initially provided quickly stepped away, leaving him to face the devastating reality of his actions. The jury watched in horrified silence as the hidden camera footage played, showing the corporate attorney casually eating a green apple after poisoning his own mother. They listened to the crystal-clear audio recording of Julian confessing his plan to inject his father with a lethal chemical. The forensic toxicology report confirmed the fatal dose of potassium chloride, and to seal the coffin, Chloe took the witness stand, securing a lenient plea deal by detailing every single aspect of her husband's financial desperation and his monstrous plot. When Arthur took the stand, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. He looked at the man sitting at the defense table in a bright orange jumpsuit. Julian looked small, pale, and entirely broken. The arrogant corporate predator was completely gone. When the prosecutor asked Arthur to identify the defendant, Arthur's voice did not shake. He stated clearly that the man sitting before them was a stranger. He formally declared that the blood ties were severed, that the boy he and Eleanor had raised had died a long time ago, replaced by a vessel of pure, unforgivable greed. The judge did not offer an ounce of leniency. Julian Pendleton was sentenced to life in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. With the heavy, suffocating chapter of vengeance finally closed, Arthur set out to honor the woman who had saved his life from beyond the grave. He could no longer walk the halls of the dark wooden house in Portland. He sold the property, packing away only the photographs and the treasured classic novels that smelled like Eleanor. He moved to a bright, sun-drenched apartment on the Oregon coast, where the massive windows overlooked the endless expanse of the blue ocean. Using the remainder of their hard-earned savings and the assets recovered from Julian's frozen accounts, Arthur established a charitable organization. He named it the Eleanor Pendleton Foundation. The charity provided free, aggressive legal representation for elderly citizens who were victims of financial fraud and familial abuse. Every single day, Arthur found a new purpose. He sat in the bright coastal office, listening to frightened seniors, holding their hands, and promising them that they were not alone. He turned the darkest tragedy of his life into a beacon of absolute hope for others. One warm Tuesday afternoon, Arthur visited the cemetery. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. He knelt beside Eleanor's headstone, placing a fresh bouquet of white lilies on the green grass. He wore the repaired vintage reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He touched the cold granite and smiled, feeling a profound, genuine peace wash over his weary soul. The nightmare was over. The ashes of his past had finally given way to the light. The story of the Pendleton family leaves us with a profound life lesson. It shows us the terrifying depths to which unchecked greed and the obsession with status can drag a human soul, destroying the most sacred bonds of family and trust. However, it also highlights the enduring, invincible power of true love. Eleanor's sacrifice and her brilliant foresight echo a beautiful humanistic value. Love does not end with a final breath. It protects, it guides, and it ultimately paves the way for justice and healing. We learn that while betrayal can come from those closest to us, our resilience and our ability to turn deep pain into a protective shield for the vulnerable can give our lives an entirely new, beautiful meaning. How did this story make you feel? Can you relate any part of this intense emotional journey to the realities of modern life, where trust is sometimes taken for granted? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to listen to the feelings coming from the bottom of your heart. If this story touched you, please hit the subscribe button, like, and share this video so we can continue bringing you captivating stories every single day. We want to take a moment to wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and daily peace in your mind and soul. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.